Hi everyone, thank you for joining and thank you to my guest. My name is Liam Duffy. I'm a strategic advisor for the Counter-Extremism Project, who I'm sure you know is an international policy organization with offices in New York, Brussels, Berlin and London. I'm obviously part of the UK team, you can probably tell by my accent. And as just very quickly mentioned there, I had a bit of a technological mare, as we say in Britain this morning. So I'm on my phone, which is less than ideal. And I'm straight off a long haul flight. So I'm going to do my absolute best to keep the conversation flowing and to keep up with a guest today who I really, really admire and who's writing and thinking on this subject and a lot of different subjects has had a massive influence on my own thinking. And even when he writes about something that's nothing to do with extremism or terrorism, such as visiting Disneyland in the middle of COVID, I'm always sure to read that as well. So I'm delighted to be joined by Graeme Wood, who I'm sure will be familiar to most people on the call, who's a journalist and a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's also the author of Way of the Strangers, Encounters with the Islamic State, which is just a phenomenal book about various encounters with Salafi jihadists around the world and supporters of the Islamic State. He's also, Graeme, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think at one point it may still be you're author of the most read article in The Atlantic's history, the What ISIS Really Wants article. Is that right?
I believe that's still true.
That's still true, yeah. So obviously very important and, some people liked it, some people didn't like it so much, but obviously massively influenced the debate back in 2015, 16, I think, when it was published. And to this day, I recommend anybody who's starting out in the field trying to study counterterrorism extremism. I think that's one of the absolute must-reads they should have on their reading list. So, Graeme, thank you for joining us.
Liam, thank you so much. There's one thing I'll correct, which is that if you think there are no serious extremists who are among adult Disney fans, then you have not encountered adult Disney fans. The anger that you can get from that crowd is every bit the equal of Salafi jihadists. It's just less violent.
I must say, you looked a bit angry yourself in that famous photo of you. Were you going down a log flume or like a roller coaster or something with your COVID mask on?
Yeah, I did have to do that for my reporting, and it's not my natural habitat. So if I looked uncomfortable, it was because I was.
You did well. A very funny piece. So obviously, as the title suggests, we're going to be talking about the Satanic Verses fatwa, its broader impact on culture and other episodes of violence against blasphemers. I'm sure everybody will be really pleased to have seen, I think just a few days ago, the New Yorker did a profile with Salman Rushdie for the first time since the attack back in August. And he's obviously posted photos of himself post-attack. I mean, we hadn't heard much for so many months, so it's really encouraging to see him. I think unfortunately he's lost his sight in one eye and lost the use of a hand, and he's obviously got some other scarring and things, but I think it looks like his sense of humor is intact. So obviously that was great to see. So I think just to introduce it, I think most people know the story by now, but we're just coming up on, I think we're a few days ahead of obviously Valentine's Day, which would make it 34 years since the original Satanic Verses fatwa declared by Ayatollah Khomeini. I think Salman Rushdie's late friend Christopher Hitchens called it the single worst review a novelist had ever received in history. So obviously, teasingly, but obviously there was a campaign of violence actually connected in the immediate few years surrounding that fatwa, that declaration, which not only pronounced death on Salman Rushdie, but on anybody connected with the book, whether they're publishers, translators, promoters, and things like that. So. Graeme, like I said, most people probably are familiar with the story, but I was just wondering if you could help set the scene a little bit, go back 34 years ago, what was happening geopolitically, and what was the immediate response and impact to this declaration?
Yes, I was quite young at that point, but I remember it vividly. It was one of the news stories that really brought my mind online when it came to global affairs, and the fact that there were implications to even to my daily life as a young person going to bookstores of things that were happening on the other side of the world. So yes, you're right. On Valentine's Day, 1989, the fatwa became publicized, and I remember vividly that there were actually bombs that were posted in front of bookstores in the West, in London. There was debate over whether bookstores would stock this book, which was universally agreed to be a worthwhile book as literature. And there was, I think, a a moment when of realization among many people who thought that after the Iran-Iraq war had been raging for a while, and after the acute phase of the Iranian Revolution as pertained to American interests seemed to have passed, that no, it hadn't. And quite intentionally, the Ayatollah Khomeini had pronounced this fatwa, this judgment of death against not just Salman Rushdie, but anybody who was associated with the publication and dissemination of his book, that he pronounced this because he needed to shore up his reputation, his bona fides, and his importance as a leader of an extremist movement in the Islamic world. So that takes us up to the day of the fatwa, and soon after there was, as you mentioned, a spate of public violence. There were, of course, demonstrations, many deaths of people who were not directly associated with the book, and then a few, of course, of people who were, attacks against translators, publishers, Italy, Norway, Japan, and alarmingly very little when it came to justice in these attacks. In most cases, we don't know who did them, or we certainly don't have resolution to that. You know, when I think though of this event, I think of some of my very earliest reporting, because when I first went to Iran in 2004, in 2009, I was very curious about what people were thinking of Khomeini, this figure whom I had known about through my entire reading life. And I made a point of going to Khomeini's tomb, the shrine surrounding his tomb, on the days that were the anniversaries, the 5-year anniversary, the lustral anniversaries of when he came back to Iran triumphantly at the beginning of the revolution. And in both cases, pretty much the same thing happened, which was there were government officials in pickup trucks who were throwing out juice boxes and cookies to crowds. But the crowds were not huge. And most noteworthy, once those freebies stopped being handed out, nobody was there. Everybody left. It was just me and a few people who didn't seem to be marking the anniversary. So I think one thing that we might think of in the kind of long haul of this horrible event is what that would look like from the perspective of 1989. You know, if you were to say, in a couple dozen years, what is the reputation of Khomeini going to be? How much fervor is there going to be surrounding the days that would be important in marking his rule? And the answer is quite literally that he, as a charismatic figure, as a leader, had run out of juice. That people were not enthusiastic about him in the same way that I think was expected or intended in 1989 with this effort to cement his permanent, even after his life on Earth, his permanent reputation as the leader of this type of extreme and transnational leadership of extreme versions of Islam. So that's, I think, the best news that I could give, is that if we were to look at this from 1989, we would notice that Salman, although gravely wounded, lives. His book, although briefly suppressed, is widely available. And the figures who were trying to profit off of it they're dead as a matter of biology, but they're also dead as a matter of ideology, in the sense that they have not spawned anything like the self-sustaining movement. It's become, for reasons we can get into, I'm pleased to say, a zombie movement, in that it exists as a bureaucratic phenomenon, as an institutional phenomenon, but not as a matter of individual fervor in the way that I think it was intended to be, and that's entirely for the good.
No, thank you. That's a really helpful assessment, and I think we'll come back to some of the things you mentioned there. I was just wondering, I mean, maybe this is an unfair question, but do you think, maybe without getting into the nitty gritty of the theological complaints, do you think you could give us a bit of a summary of what the central complaints against the novel were, because obviously before the fatwa, there was I had already been out for a year, hadn't it? So I think there were some protests in the UK, famously some book burnings in Bradford. People remember those and still write about those, in Pakistan and India, and protests in other places as well. But as you said, geopolitics and local regional rivalries played their role in the decision to launch the fatwa, which came many months after the book's publication. But what were, again, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the theology, what were those complaints against the novel?
So in short, the complaint was blasphemy. This was not a complaint that was lodged by the Ayatollah knowledgeably. He could not have read it. I don't believe it had been translated at that point into Persian or a language that he could read. But in one word, that's what it was. The novel takes as its substrate early Islamic history and an imaginative and I use this word carefully, disrespectful reading of early Islamic history from the perspective of Khomeini's orthodoxy. So there is, first of all, the very title is referring to this famous incident in early Islam, which involves the sort of whispering to the prophet of false verses that encourage him to sort of give a shout out to pre-Islamic deities who he had been famously involved in clearing out of the shrines of Mecca. So there's that. There is also and the subsequent very interesting controversies in early Islam about the historical accuracy, the theological accuracy of the claim that these verses had compromised the integrity of the Quran. So the consideration of that is the beginning. There's also elements of descriptions, imaginative descriptions, fictionalized descriptions of the wives of the prophet in a modern context, also totally off limits. And so any of these things were considered enough to get the death sentence. Now, the very fact that this was that this death sentence was pronounced when it's not the first time that someone has defamed Islam in the eyes of the Ayatollah Khomeini or religious extremists. So we of course have to think of it in that context of okay, this thing that's happened before, someone in Tehran or Qom has decided that now is the time for controversy over this. Now is the time to create an international incident over it, and then that's what happened.
Hmm. So just before we move on from this, I was wondering if you could. I think we saw really a kind of foreshadowing of the response to some later, let's call them blasphemy affairs or controversies or episodes, in the kind of cultural response in Western countries. So I was wondering if we could just touch on that a little bit, because I mean, there was some people that maybe you would consider liberal, progressive on the left that said that it was wrong to offend minority sensibilities in this way. Then there were some people there were some high-profile figures in the Conservative Party in the UK who did not like Salman Rushdie one bit because he was seen as a left-wing figure who'd attacked Britain and empire and its colonial legacy and things like that. There were some people in the church who were using it to again, in their own way, to make such religious criticism off limits as well. I think even President Jimmy Carter had a bit of a questionable statement on this affair. So could you talk to us about that response? So there was a bit of moral confusion there, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, that to put it mildly, Jimmy Carter had an op-ed in the New York Times where he said, "This is a bad book. This is a bad man," and he really should have thought twice before insulting so many people by saying these bad things. Jimmy Carter is a poet, by the way, so he's a producer of literature. And if you wish to compare Jimmy Carter's literature to Salman Rushdie's, then I think the winner of that contest will be easily visible. But yes, he finds people who were an ex-president of the United States, someone who was sworn to uphold the Constitution, to guard things like the First Amendment, the right of American novelists, British novelists, anybody in any U.S. person to live without fear of being killed for saying things. So it was pretty shocking to find out how many people had not internalized the importance of this mission. People who were, you know, guardians of that value, writers, for example, who make their living by writing with the expectation that they can say what they wish to say. You know, in Jimmy Carter, having been a U.S. president, is a good famous example. But the number of people, we could go down the list and find shameful statements from people like John le Carré, who said, "Look, you defame a major religion, you get what you're going to get." And it took, I think, a bit of time before that reaction was exposed for the shame that it deserved. And I think what we've seen in subsequent blasphemy incidents is actually something similar. It's not quite something you can set your watch by, but it is a very interesting, predictable dynamic at this point, where when there is some quote unquote provocation, then there is the response to that provocation, which is to be defended by certain defenders of free speech, and then certain others who have, as if they have sort of lost their antibodies. There's many metaphors we can now use in pandemic times for this, but as if they have lost their antibodies and have had to regain them through exposure to a horrifying incident like this. So at that moment, there were a lot of people who were not very stiff-backed on this issue. And then the rhythm proceeded, where I think within about 10 years or so, there was more, I think, unanimity on this issue among intelligentsia. And then at various points that those antibodies have waned. And I think the incident this summer, the attempted near successful assassination of Rushdie was, you know, there's the only upside to it would be that there are a few people who have realized, oh yeah, this is something that requires constant, eternal defense. And Rushdie's near death is a reminder of that.
But just before we come to that, so that's what I want to talk about next. I think some of the most interesting responses, I think, looking back to, let's call it a bit of a failure among some sections of the Western intellectual scene, whether the left or right. There were failures across the political spectrum, I think, to defend Rushdie. But there was some really interesting critiques of that response from Arab intellectuals, from like left-wing figures in the Muslim world, from Iranian dissidents. I think I've forgotten the guy's name, but there's a Syrian left-wing writer, I think, who was just scathing about the response from Western intellectuals. I think he compared it to, he said that, you know, Western intellectuals would offer their support to dissidents from communist countries in Eastern Europe, but they failed to see Salman Rushdie as a kind of, as he put it, as like a Muslim dissident who was, you know, hoping to spark internal debate and potentially reform from the culture within it which he emerged. So that was a really interesting critique. You don't have to comment on that if you don't want to, but if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's just important to, as you say, to note that this type of incident was not as strange as other parts of the world. It was the transnational aspect of it that made it something that we're talking about right now, and a global incident. I mean, you find things like the attempted killing of Naguib Mahfouz for a similar kind of allegorical treatment of early Islam, and a similarly rich literary treatment of early Islam. So although this happened to a then British citizen and to his American wife at the time too, this was something that had afflicted other places. And like many aspects of the Iranian Revolution, it was an attempt to make this go global that caused it to be a conversation topic in every major European capital and Western capital.
Yeah, there's an interesting, I guess, dynamic there that I think maybe we can come back to when we talk about later affairs, but like the intersection of technology with these things that, you know, obviously novels or even cartoons later that were probably intended for a very specific and limited audience can suddenly be beamed all over the world. I mean, obviously 1989, we're talking more television, radio and telephone, but later on social media, you know, something, again, which has a very specific audience in mind, comes from a very specific cultural context can suddenly, go global. And I think that's obviously changed things. But let's come to last.
In my first visit to Iran, it was in 2004. I was on a boat from Sharjah to Bandar Abbas, and I realized I had in my backpack a copy of the Baburnama in Wheeler Thaxton's translation. And as I was reading, I realized it had on the cover, introduction by Salman Rushdie. And I was about to go through immigration in Iran. So and I had to literally rip the cover off of the book because it would likely attract the attention, and it could have gone badly. That's 2004. Right now, if you want to read Salman Rushdie's work in Iran, you can do so in seconds. It takes the amount of circumvention that you have to undertake to actually just get the book is basically zero. And that's going to change the scene considerably.
So let's come to last August. Obviously, I think one of the great ironies of that incident was literally, I think, 2 weeks before the attack, the attempted assassination and nearly successful assassination of Sir Salman Rushdie. I think he'd even started saying, his life is fairly normal again. He's taking less precautions. He's doing more public appearances and things like that. And then obviously in an extremely grim turn of irony, somebody actually finally gets to him after 33 and a half years of avoiding the Khomeini's assassins and supporters and agents. I guess one of the real reasons that I wanted to talk about this is, especially with you, I think you wrote on this at the time, and you reminded people that, coming back to the fact that Ayatollah Khomeini is dead, this fatwa cannot be rescinded. It's still, for supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, it's still relevant. It's still legitimate. But one of the real reasons that I wanted to talk to you and talk about this subject is, maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't. It strikes me that this was an attack on a British and American citizen in the United States on the orders of a foreign state, and I guess there was a bit of I would characterize it as a non-response. I think I agree with you. There was unanimity, of support from other writers and intellectuals this time around. But in terms of the diplomatic response, I mean, it was near crickets from either the British or the American government. Am I characterizing that correctly in your view?
I think that's a correct characterization of the public response to this. We've seen just in the last couple of weeks a little bit more of a peek into some of the law enforcement response to Iranian operations in the United States, specifically surrounding the very nearly successful attempt to kill the dissident Masih Ali-Nejad in Brooklyn, New York, which suggests that a great deal is going on behind the scenes to establish culpability, to establish how these things are happening, and none of this was known until the unsealing of a criminal complaint. So it's quite possible that the United States is laboring mightily on this issue, but it's not happening in public. And if it were happening in public, it's not clear what the actions would be. This is, of course, all tied up with attempts in some quarters to reignite the JCPOA, and in other quarters to exert maximum pressure. So what pressure is left to exert after this? We might see a bit more movement once there is a public statement of exactly what the United States thinks happened. But in the meantime, there's been, as you say, basically nothing.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you. I saw some of the reporting on especially the assassination attempts that you mentioned. There's been some assassination attempts of dissidents in Britain as well. Yeah, I guess maybe I'm a bit disappointed in the British government response, publicly at least, on this. So obviously, I guess it's probably playing less of a role behind the scenes than the American government. But I don't want to push this too hard, but it does seem absent, the British government to me seemed absent in previous affairs as well, like the 2020 assassination of Samuel Paty across the Channel. I think a lot of European governments came out and made quite strong statements about that, but the British government didn't really seem to enter that debate. So I guess maybe it's more disappointment at the British government response. He's still a British citizen, he's a dual citizen of the United States as well.
I mean, the statements comparing to 1989, when of course there was a threat, but there was no actual physical attack, are I think, instructive. In 1989, there was a period when even the president of the United States, who was the sitting president of the United States, was waffling over whether this is something that really implicated him as the American president, and this is happening overseas against a British citizen. So that there was a moment of real waffling in that sense. Whereas now I don't know precisely what the I believe Blinken and others have put out statements condemning the attack, the least they can do. And then the next thing to watch for is substance. If there is, if this is traceable directly back to Tehran, which it seems quite likely that it will be, but I have no direct reporting to say that, then I think substantive response is absolutely called for, and I look forward to seeing what that would be.
Yeah, let's before we move on, let's talk about those connections potentially to the regime in Iran. So I guess maybe we've been so used to like the kind of ISIS inspired attacks over the last few years that maybe there's a perception that this guy was just somebody like a bit of a fanboy who was kind of inspired because I think he had Facebook, in a picture of Soleimani on his Facebook and things like that. So I think maybe we internalized it a bit like that, like it was just a fanboy doing something, acting in an inspiration rather than coordinated directly. But if you actually look back, you mentioned this in passing as well. So if you look back at that initial assassinations campaign, and we go all the way up to, I think it was 1993, the shooting of William Nygaard in Oslo. But then there was in Japan and Italy as well, assassinations and attempted assassinations. As you mentioned, there's been no justice for those attacks. We don't know who the perpetrators were. There are some clues looking back that do point to actual Iranian involvement in terms of like the professionalism of the hit jobs, the way, again, just the fact that no suspects were ever caught in a lot of these cases points to more than just an amateur operation, more than just somebody who's angry about Salman Rushdie in the book picking up a knife and doing it themselves. So you think, I guess, looking at this most recent attack, but also that round of attacks, you think, what's your take on the level of Iranian involvement?
So I think we need to look at this in terms of an Iranian policy on assassinations, which we start to see the recent iteration, the attempt to kill Ali Najad, the attempt to kill Rushdie, it seems like there are some similarities here, which is the attempt to have, Iran is a modern country with properly trained assassins. If they want to just use their best people to go and kill Masih Ali Najad or Salman Rushdie, I am quite certain that is within their capability. The result of that would be, if it were directly linked, potentially catastrophic for parts of the Iranian government. So what we've seen instead is this attempt to use criminal cutouts and knuckleheads in much the way that ISIS had tried to do, as a way to avoid direct attribution for these attacks. So Ali Najad, the criminal complaint, which looks quite convincing to me, says that the gunman Khalid Mahdiev was part of a Eastern European Iranian organized crime ring that had guidance from inside Iran, although it's not said directly by whom. So this attempt to use these cutouts is clearly an attempt to muddy the waters and to keep a separation between the people who, at a low cost of a few tens of thousands of dollars, in the case of Ali Najad, and probably much less in the case of the attempted assassin of Rushdie, to use them to avoid direct pushback. And that is something that I think it may be, in some ways, it may be, I don't know about the attempted killings in Italy, Norway, and Japan, the state of the knowledge of attribution of those, but it's something that is consistent with that, and is certainly consistent with the interests of Iran right now, both in continuing to hunt people down, and then in doing it in such a way that there's at least a smidge of deniability to keep from suffering the wrath that the United States has explicitly promised to them if there is a direct connection that's found.
Mm. Okay, let's just conscious of the time, so let's move on. I promise we talk about other episodes of violence and other affairs or episodes, incidents as well. So obviously this initial round we've talked about, I guess that fatwa was transformative in many ways. Obviously it was transformative for the individuals at its center, but it was transformative in terms of the precedent it set on later affairs and also the influence I guess it had. It kind of crossed the sectarian divide and had a massive influence on Sunni Islamist movements as well. So to what extent do you think that the precedent set by that fatwa is important in what we saw later with maybe the response to the Yellen's Poston cartoons, but also the assassination attempts which were led by Al-Qaeda on various cartoonists relating to that, and then obviously I think the most infamous and bloodiest episode that we saw was the Charlie Hebdo massacre as well. So is the fatwa relevant to those later affairs? Make of that what you will.
Yeah, very much so. Of course it is, because it was the first time that many of us observed something like this. That is the hand of the hand of Islamists reaching across national borders to the West to kill people for the crime of blasphemy. And what the effect of that to some people like me is to forever give us a template in our minds of what is going on here, why these values matter, and why they have to be met with unequivocal condemnation. So unfortunately, this happens with any kind of model of horrific event, where you start seeing it once and then you start realizing it happens again and again. And the reactions to it, there is this pedagogical effect where that if you think for a second, maybe this is something that maybe Rushdie did something wrong. Maybe he didn't deserve to die, but maybe he did something wrong. Well, that's a reaction that the aftermath of the Rushdie fatwa, or the quick after the few years afterward, the debate about that trained a lot of people to realize that debate is one that is not new, and that it has a proper resolution, which I think has strengthened the response to other incidents, to Charlie Hebdo and others. Not to say that the response was satisfactory from all quarters, but it was the touchstone that has allowed a lot of other people to, in subsequent incidents, to have a sense of what was going on immediately once it happened, because we had seen it before, and these attacks were not fundamentally different from what had happened.
Mm. So yeah, speaking about that response, so I think you've written about this as well. But there's, after Charlie Hebdo, I think honestly, I probably spent about 2 days sitting in front of watching news discussions of that, like debates and all these different shows and reading, and I was honestly had like in open jaw watching some of these debates that I couldn't. To me, it was such a clear cut moral issue, but there was still a lot of confusion, I think, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo massacre, and attempts to posthumously smear the victims, and basically a kind of a version of they were wearing a short skirt, so deserved it kind of thing. And I think you've written about the response from, was it sections of there was an open letter, I think, which I know you hate open letters, but there was an open letter from PEN America, or so not from PEN America, but some people associated with PEN America's honoring of Charlie Hebdo. Yes,
that's right. So the famous incident with PEN America, PEN America decided to honor the survivors of the editorial staff of Charlie Hebdo. Honor them because PEN America protects the rights of writers, their free expression. And they thought that, yes, the survivors of a largely massacred editorial staff of a magazine that continued to publish under these circumstances deserves our support as writers. And then lo and behold, that there was this long list of writers, many of them not bad writers, who said, maybe we shouldn't honor them. Maybe they were actually culpable, not surely for their own deaths, but for maybe being offensive, maybe not taking the side of the oppressed Muslim people of France. And so we are not thrilled by the fact that we're going to be asked to applaud them when they show up. And this struck me at the time, still strikes me as evidence that some of those antibodies that I referred to earlier from the Rushdie affair have absolutely waned. I'm glad to say are still strong in some, but that people who write for a living could not see that this disagreement with the politics of a magazine is quite irrelevant when that magazine, for its writing, has just been the target of a largely successful massacre. So it's just a very strange thing to do, to say, I actually didn't like that book that they wrote. Well, it's not about whether you like the book or not. It's the fact that someone tried to kill them for the ideas that they had, for the mode that they expressed those ideas. And it was helpful to see just that this, I've described what you might call like a thermostatic or homeostatic view of free expression and liberalism, where as the threat wanes, as the perception of the threat wanes, people start to forget why these are values that in and of themselves are worth fighting for. And then something terrible happens, and there is an occasion to be reminded of it. But just as surely as other types of antibodies wane, these ones do too. And that means that this is a constant thing that's probably going to happen, which is there will be attacks on people because of their the quote unquote offensiveness of what they've written. And those attacks will sometimes be successful. And there will be this moment of readjustment where a number of people beclown themselves by saying nasty things about the victims, and then have to be reminded publicly that that is beside the point of free expression, whether they didn't like the specific cartoons. So I'm afraid, although I'm optimistic in some ways because of the clear ideological defeat of Khomeinism, I'm pessimistic in another, in that this does seem to be an eternal struggle. It's not something that it ever wins. It is something that has to be renewed in its vigor. Unfortunately, when occasioned by an attack like the one we saw in August, or the ones that we saw at Charlie Hebdo and any number of others that we could name.
Mm. Yeah, let's so talking about those antibodies, I think I mentioned Hitchens at the beginning. He made this observation, but then Keenan Malik wrote an excellent book on I think he directly linked the fatwa to later jihadist episodes, even in the title, fatwa to jihad. I think you've made a similar argument as well, but Keenan Malik said that, and this was a few years ago, this book, so before there's been a kind of acceleration on some of these topics, but he said that a lot of some sections in our society had internalized the logic of the fatwa, and that had led to self-censorship, that had led to, especially concerning minorities and the idea of being offensive towards minorities, and that was a regrettable impact of that. I dare say that's accelerated massively since he said that. And I think you wrote about this as well, about the broader cultural impact of the fatwa, on our own logic, on our own discussions on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And I mean, one of the really regrettable things I've seen, it seems so rapidly to have happened, is just in the last few years, we've gone from freedom of speech and freedom of expression being like the bedrock of freedoms to almost being viewed in some quarters with suspicion. If you say that you're a supporter of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, that's like, oh, well, that's just a cover for attacking minorities and offending people and things like that. So yeah, could you just talk about that broader cultural impact?
Yeah, so I think it's important, first of all, to distinguish, when someone tries to say my feelings were hurt on an American or UK university campus and says, I don't want you to say those things and I'm going to withdraw an invitation, this is not the same as trying to murder someone. However, here's what it does have in common. There is a much wider belief than I would have ever predicted to exist at this late stage in the history of debates of free expression. There is this side that seems to have grown in the last 10, 20 years that says that offense is itself a reason to avoid allowing someone to publish, even if it's not a legal ban, a book ban that comes from a government and is enforced by a government. The idea that the offense is itself a reason not to publish something is absolutely on the march. And it does obviously have something to do, or rather has some similarities to what we saw with the fatwa. That there is the general principle that people are going to, in a liberal society, have views that are the opposite of your own, that are incompatible with your own, that are offensive to you. And that is just the price of living in a liberal society. That is the benefit of living in a liberal society as well. That is something that I think maybe we have failed to train generations of our citizens to appreciate, because that is like, as I say, this is not just a benefit, it's a glory of living in a liberal society, that we have that kind of toleration, that kind of diversity of opinion. And if we internalize the idea that being offended is a reason to shut your ears or to shut other people's mouths, then we lose out on that. And it feels like there's just more and more people, of Gen Z in particular, who believe that shutting the mouth of someone who is offensive is a positive good. It is not a bad thing, but it helps other people, which suggests to me that the antibodies have waned in a more fundamental way. Of course, as I say, that there are people who are shocked back into realization that, wait a minute, this view can be taken to an extreme, has been taken to an extreme historically more commonly than not, and it's bad. And maybe we should look more intensely at why that view was countered, and why the counter to that view is one that we should stand up for. So that's a short separation of what has happened in the last few years from what happened in 1989, but also a quick summary by my light of what is similar about what's happening now to what happened then.
Just a note to the audience. God, we've got really healthy numbers still on here. So I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left. So if people want to start asking questions directly to Graeme, if you could pop them in either in the Q&A if you have access to that, or in the chat, I'll do my best to come to them. What I will say is I've never been able to get to every question that we've got. So my apologies in advance if I don't get to everyone, but if you do have questions, drop them in the Q&A or the chat and I'll come to them. I'm, like I said at the beginning, having to dial in on my phone, so you might see my hand come across the screen very clumsily while I try and navigate that, but I'll do my best. Just while people are thinking of questions, just a thought that popped into my head, particularly about the response to the Charlie Hebdo massacre, but then I guess later the murder of Samuel Paty as well. It seemed to me that some sections of our own society and some people on the liberal left in particular were kind of parroting a framing of these affairs that was the one that the jihadists wanted to get across themselves. So Charlie Hebdo magazine, for example, had, in keeping with its long tradition, I think it's been sued by the Catholic Church about a dozen times. So it's got this massively anti-clerical bent to it, which is firmly situated within the traditions of the French left, comes from the French Revolution and all the blood that came after it as well. But to their minds, they were mocking a historical and religious figure. But what the jihadists wanted to say was actually this is the same as, if not worse. In fact, they outright said this is worse than attacks on, you know, like Muslim human beings. Bin Laden and al-Awlaki said, you know, these things are like borderline genocidal actions. They're worse than the kind of foreign policy and colonial complaints they had against the United States or Britain, for example. You know, this is what Bin Laden said outright. This is worse than the bombings in you know, Palestine and Iraq and Kashmir and all these places. So it's just that in that line of thinking that says, you know, they shouldn't have been attacking, you know, France's Muslim population or something like that. There seems a confusion between, you know, attacking a figure of authority within a religious tradition and attacking human beings that was inadvertently being amplified, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, the view of the Quran as not just sacrosanct, but as an inviolate thing is it's not new in Orthodox versions of Islam, and it's widely believed. So it does seem like it's an odd cause to be taken up by those who are not Muslim at all. Which is, I think, what we kind of have seen in the aggressive elevation of the critics, even the nonviolent critics of some of these incidents, by liberals and the left in the West. That seems to be a real phenomenon, and one of the more curious of them to me, that this would be, you know, that you would take an extreme position on someone else's religion, which is what ends up happening when you're guided less by when you're guided by the existence of offense as the sign of something that you want to stop, rather than by the liberal value of toleration.
Yeah, just before I come to the audience questions as well, I guess like something we haven't touched on is, I think one thing that people will say is, you know, well, you know, it's not a big deal if we don't have, you know, if there's not more offensive or provocative cartoons in the world or anything like that. But actually, you know, the attacks really is the tiniest part of the picture here. What the actual impact of this is much broader. You know, as we've talked about, the entire shifting of attitudes towards freedom of speech, towards certain content. Excuse me, but we've also seen extensive like self-censorship in media, in literature relating to this. We've seen, you know, not everybody who falls foul of these accusations is being deliberately provocative and offensive. Not that matters, as you mentioned, but there's people who are genuinely trying to write novels. Tom Holland, the historian, got attacked because he wrote he produced a documentary, you know, a historical investigation into the origins of Islam, and it's, you know, it's spread throughout the Middle East. So, you know, people who are genuinely trying to do historical work, trying to write novels, trying to paint paintings. And speaking of paintings, you wrote about the affair with the art history professor. Am I pronouncing it right? Is it Hamlin University?
Hamlin University, that's right, in Minnesota, USA.
Yeah. So do you want to touch on that before we go to audience questions, and maybe talk about the broader? For
those in the audience who aren't familiar with this incident, it's a small Methodist college in the United States, where a adjunct, that is temporary art history professor, warned her students that there would be an image, I believe 14th century image of the Prophet Muhammad that would be shown, that was relevant to this global art history class. And anyone who didn't want to see this could not be present that day. So it was shown. And then the resulting hubbub was quite interesting in what had happened, and maybe suggest that there's a difference in what's happening now to what might have happened to a previous generation. It was the college that said, this person is effectively fired, who will not renew her contract because she has done this racist and Islamophobic act. An extraordinary cheapening of these terms. And then it was, among others, Muslim organizations that said, no, it actually matters that she was doing this because she was trying to educate her students. It matters that she cared very much about whether her students were going to be offended by this and gave them a chance to step out. And the university should reinstate her. So it's another case similar to what I was referring to before, of people who are taking offense as the value to be as the thing to be avoided, and then as a result of that, elevating some extreme versions of fanatical conservative Islam that are not even the versions that are mainstream among mainstream Muslim organizations. So this leads to topsy-turvy decisions, and the ultimate fate of that incident, as of now, is that the faculty of that college said that they have no confidence in the leader of the college, who, when asked to revise her opinion and to state her commitment to academic freedom, effectively just declined to do so and said, no, we live in a place where we have to watch out for people's feelings. And the faculty quite rightly said, you're making fools of us right now, and we don't trust you to lead this organization, which she still does as of today.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to try my best to navigate the Q&A function. Sorry if you see my fat fingers going across the screen here. Actually, so this is a little bit unrelated to our discussion here, but somebody's, I guess, picking up on your wider work on jihadist movements and things like that. Maybe you can give us, I mentioned you've done some fantastic writing on this, which I would direct members of the audience to, especially, but somebody's asked about the state of the jihadist movement since the kind of territorial defeat of the caliphate. Where do you see that movement at the moment? Do you see the winds out of its sails, or do you see that there could be a wave of threat again? Just your assessment on that. I know that's very different to our discussion, but I think people are interested in your other writing on this as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. ISIS is still in existence, but I think the wind has shifted in a number of ways. It's shifted geographically. So if we're going to look at where ISIS is most active, we're more looking in Africa at this point than we are in the Levant and in Iraq, although there's absolutely still burbling of activity there. And I've always thought of ISIS as a movement that will absolutely ebb and flow. Even ISIS has described itself as such a movement. Inherent in their view of their eschatology, of their ideology, is that they're not gonna win them all. They're gonna win the big one, but they believe that they will be reduced to their last 5,000 men at some point, and then they will respawn. And if you look in West Africa, if you look in the last couple of years in northern Mozambique, you see attempts to do that. You see attempts to reseed and then resume business. And then to bring it back then to this Rushdie discussion and how this affects free expression in the West, that I think it's instructive to look back at the way ISIS spawned in the first place in Syria. There was this attempt to on the part of the West to largely ignore what was happening there, believing that this very benighted area of Syria, northern Iraq, if they wanted to go there, then they were welcome to it. Be our guest. If you want to congregate in a place that no one else wants to go to, then we'd rather you do that than be everywhere and try to have footholds in other places that were more connected to the rest of the world. And a little belatedly, we discovered that that's probably not a good idea. That even when they are congregating in Raqqa, the effects will be felt in France, and that is a predictable outcome. So yes, it's going to take some time. I mean, ISIS has been licking its wounds and operating in places that are not even as connected as Raqqa was in 2013. But respawning is almost a certainty. It's just a matter of time. Now, I think there's also, for groups that are not ISIS, and this is what I think interests me most over the long term. I spent a lot of time looking at what ISIS meant to people, what members of ISIS thought, what their theology was, what their view of the world was. And that includes what their political views are and their tactical views. And I think ISIS was a huge deal for, even in its defeat, for other jihadist movements, because it showed that this was a model for success. Even though it lost, I think a lot of groups will look at that and say, what ISIS did got further than anyone else, got further than Al-Qaeda, got further than any other Sunni jihadist group. So if we're trying to respond, if we're trying to do something that's successful, that remains the working model of how to do it well. And finally, the other aspect of this is it also shows why Iran, as a revolutionary jihadist state, is such a thing to be concerned about. Not something that can be left to do what it pleases. Iran was in the time of Khomeini, kind of charismatic jihadist state that has since been bureaucratized, institutionalized, and as an ideological matter is a zombie state, but is no less a threat because of that. It is what happens if this type of extremist view is allowed to become institutionalized and made permanent. That is, we're still dealing with it in the form of stabbed novelists, nearly killed Americans on their stoops in Brooklyn, as of today.
Great. Somebody else has asked about, we haven't really touched on this, but it's hugely relevant. Somebody else has asked about the potential impact of the Quran burning by the far-right figure in Sweden who's made a stunt of burning a Quran, and obviously there's sparked protests around the world. And interestingly, we talked about the geopolitics behind some of these affairs. I think geopolitics massively played a role in some people like President Erdogan's decision to kind of ratchet this up to impact Sweden's attempts to join NATO and things like that. But maybe you could talk about that, but also talk about the potential. Do you think that's got the potential to spill over or have the same impact or spark a kind of wave of plots and attacks potentially?
In short, no. I don't think it's likely to have anything like the effect, certainly of the Rushdie fatwa. But you're quite right to situate it as you have geopolitically. I mean, these things, there are many Quran burnings we never hear anything about. There are desecrations and affronts, offenses that do not make any news at all. And it matters a great deal that this particular case is situated in attempts to join NATO, in irritations by the Turkish Republic at those attempts. And you should expect when one of these events rises to the level of public discussion and public knowledge, that there's probably some other reason too, that they are pretext for other types of political debate. And then in some cases, they spill beyond that. So the Rushdie fatwa might be an example of that, where it acquires a life of its own. And I don't have any reason to believe in this particular case it will, but yeah, it's very likely connected to larger geopolitical discussion.
We even saw the same after the assassination or murder of Samuel Paty, the school teacher in France. I think that the massive wave of global controversy that followed that was at least in part due to Macron and Erdogan's rivalry in the Mediterranean. And, he was obviously very keen to portray Macron as, this great oppressor of Muslims, and he himself as a great defender of Muslims. But also, I think on the back of that, it became very public, France's attempts to curb Islamist influence non-violent Islamist influence in France. So obviously some of the domestic Islamist scenes overseas sponsors, that didn't sit too well with them. So obviously they started to kind of make a fuss about that. I'm going to finish with,
of course, in that case, the beheading of a school teacher is not something that happens frequently, and is not the public knowledge of that is not nearly as fraught with pretext as the burning of a Quran. So, but your point is taken.
On the the assassination of a school teacher. I mean, I think something that's not really being appreciated is just how much those campaigns have actually proliferated in Europe as well. There's been similar campaigns against a variety of other teachers in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. There was a campaign we saw against a British school teacher. So, these things really hang over the classroom now to an extent. So somebody went under police protection in France recently. A school teacher didn't show Charlie Hebdo cartoons, just mentioned the Charlie Hebdo attack and received threats and attack so that was a pretty unnerving turn of events. I just want to finish. There's a really, really good question. Probably one of my favorite question that I can see just to round off. Might be a bit of a tough one and an unfair one for you, but somebody's asked, what would you say if somebody's trotting out those arguments about after Charlie Hebdo, after the initial Satanic Verses fatwa, what would your response be? I guess people want their ammunition loaded. What would you say to those people making those arguments? What's the correct response?
All right, so there are different arguments that happen at different times. The Charlie Hebdo response was slightly different from the Rushdie response. What it comes down to is if this person is in the West, a beneficiary of being in the West, I would suggest that this person understand what is liberalism. You need to understand that this is something that you have been the beneficiary of, and that this is something that is hard won. This is something that has not existed for very long, and whose proliferation through Europe, through North America, has been an enormous boon. And what does it consist of? It consists of allowing people to say things that are offensive. It consists of allowing people to say things that you yourself disagree with as strongly as one can. And if you take away that, then everything else collapses from on top of it. It is truly a bedrock value. And anything that you appreciate about living in the West is probably in some way related to that. So why would you bargain that away? Why would you give that away so readily, as so many people were willing to do, by equivocating when someone has as clearly as possible said, no, I don't want that. We don't want that. We are going to react to this in either a censorious way or in a murderous way. This is going to erode everything that you yourself value, and it's going to do so for very little benefit. To allow, in principle, the censorship of anything that you have to say because you might be giving offense is to gag yourself. And this is if you don't understand why this is going to be redound to your own harm, then you simply are not aware of the bedrock values of your own civilization. Now, if someone is not aware of the bedrock values of his own civilization, that is a larger civic problem that I do not have an answer to. The good news is that, as I say, these things have a thermostatic effect. Liberalism in general, once it is attacked, has a way of activating some of its defenses. We've seen that not just in the case of free expression issues, but perhaps also in Ukraine, where there's suddenly a renewed realization that no, the concept of national borders, for example, not being negotiated through violent conflict is something that we need to uphold. The idea that there might be elections rather than permanent lifetime appointments of leaders is something that should be upheld. These things were not widely realized before they were threatened as they are since they're being threatened. And I would encourage anybody who is waffling on a Rushdie-like issue to notice that this is the rhythm that has obtained in a number of things like this. And so if the threat happens, I wouldn't want them to have to wait to belatedly come to the realization that one of their own values is under attack.
Amazing. I think fantastic note to wrap up a spirited defense of liberalism and freedom of speech to end it. And I hope that answered the question of having a having some ready-made points for when you encounter these arguments in the wild. So thank you so much for that. Just before we go, have you got anything you want to add, or anything coming up that people should be aware of? Or if they want to, where can they find you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Liam, you and CEP do great work, and I really appreciate your inviting me here. You can find me at The Atlantic. If you're interested in ISIS, then my book, The Way of the Strangers, is where I direct you to, and then I'm on Twitter at GCAW.
Interested in ISIS or Disneyland? That's the tagline.
Yes, two very different threats.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you for everybody who tuned in. Obviously, this was a very popular one, and we've had great numbers tuning in, and I'm sure more people will tune in when this goes up on YouTube as well. So really sorry if I didn't get to everybody's questions, but maybe you can send a tweet to Graeme or something like that if you welcome that kind of thing. But yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll end the webinar now. Thank you.
Thanks so much.